I would like to invite the Secretariat for an announcement of the time and the venue for the contact group on new proposed program of work. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, colleagues. With regards to the way forward in for the contact group, I'm pleased to announce that the non-paper on item 6 will be published shortly within the next half an hour, and then it will be posted on the website. Additionally, please take note that the contact group will convene at 3 p.m. The room will be posted. It's a room EF, is the bureau room at level 3. That's where the contact group will meet on item 6 at 3 p.m. Furthermore, it is also scheduled that the contact group will have a second session at 7:30 p.m. tonight. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. It is now my intention to move to agenda item 7 on the joint program of work on the links between biological and cultural diversity, concerning a review and update of the 4 adopted traditional knowledge indicators. You may recall that these 4 indicators for traditional knowledge on linguistic diversity, land tenure, traditional occupations, and participation were recommended by indigenous peoples and the local communities and adopted more than a decade ago by the Conference of the Parties for our previous strategy plan, 2010 to 2020. Now, I give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce the item. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In Decision 50/22 on nature and culture, the Conference of the Parties renewed its commitment to the joint program of work on the links between biological and cultural diversity with the aim of supporting the national and subnational implementation of the framework. The renewed commitment included the adoption of a new elements and tasks for a joint program of work. Paragraph 5 of the same decision, the Conference of the Parties requested the Executive Secretary and invited the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization and the International Union for Conservation of Nature, along with a broad coalition of partners and with the full and effective participation of indigenous people and local communities, to implement the new element and task described in the annex to that decision. Under Task 2.A, the working group, together with the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice, is instructed to review and update the 4 indicators on traditional knowledge, which were adopted in Decision 13/28, and which are relevant to the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity in light of the framework. To assist the working group in this task, the acting Executive Secretary sent out a notification to invite parties, other governments, indigenous people and local communities, and stakeholders to provide views and information on the status of the data and information, operational review and update of the 4 TK indicators, namely trend of linguistic diversity and number of speakers of indigenous languages, trends in land use change and land tenure in the traditional territories of indigenous and local communities, trends in the practice of traditional occupations, trends in the degree to which traditional knowledge and practices are respected through their full integration, safeguards in the national implementation of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. The working group has before it a document prepared by the Secretariat on the basis of the information received, titled Joint Program of Work on the Links Between Biological and Cultural Diversity, Review and Update of the 4 Adopted Traditional Knowledge Indicators. The document is CBD/WG8j-12/6. Based on this document, the working group is invited to make recommendations on indicators on traditional knowledge for consideration by the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice at its 26th meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Secretary. Now I'm pleased to announce that we will be privileged to hear from Dr. James Williams, who serves as the co-chair of the Ad hoc Technical Expert Group on Indicators. Dr. Williams will be providing us with an update on the progress and the work being carried out by the AdTech on indicators. Dr. Williams, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity for Maria Cecilia Londono, who is my co-chair, and I to provide this update on progress on the indicators ARTEC to the 8J working group. A little bit of background to start off with. As part of the agreement of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, a monitoring framework was also agreed, and that Decision 15.5 also mandated the establishment of an ARTEC. Lots of people were nominated, and the Bureau selected 45 experts, and at the first meeting, Maria and I were elected as co-chairs. The ARTEC has a large and complex mandate and is due to run to COP16. Space on the slide, I'm afraid, does not allow me to provide the full text, but I will note there's considerable detail under the first point, and we are making good progress towards that mandate being completed. The ARTEC has held 2 online meetings so far. The first meeting focused on understanding which of the indicators in the ARTEC's terms of reference the individual experts would focus on and reviewing a draft work plan. The co-chairs and the Secretariat then worked to finalise that work plan, collate information on who would work on each indicator, and develop outlines for the metadata needed, focusing on the questions that the ARTEC has been asked to address. The second meeting focused on binary indicators, of which more in a moment. 5 subgroups were established to break the tasks into more manageable chunks, and a considerable amount of editing followed the meeting to collate views on possible questions and answers in order to produce the Substa 25 paper. A third meeting at the start of October was a face-to-face discussion in Montreal, where we reviewed progress in developing metadata for each of the headline indicators and started consideration of some of the other aspects of the work plan. Coming back to the binary indicators, I understand that these were not discussed in any detail at COP15, and potentially are complex in nature with ands and ors within the titles of the draft binary indicators and in the questions that might be asked of parties. At its second meeting, the ARTEC decided that it would make sense for parties in their national reports to be able to provide more nuanced answers rather than just yes or no, and that answers needed might need to vary according to the questions being asked. And the ARTEC also agreed that the questions asked should be more focused to help the parties respond. Substa 25 reviewed that work, and the general approach was agreed. There was a lot of discussion of the detail of the wording of the questions, and Substa will come back to that at Substa 26. At the third meeting of the ARTEC, each of the headline indicators was reviewed in detail and notes added to the documents being developed on each of them. A summary table was produced, which is in the report of that meeting, which summarises the follow-up actions needed and our understanding of its status of development. It's fair to say that some of these indicators will be difficult to make operational. There's a lot of work involved. To make sure progress continues at pace, 1 or more chaperones were identified to facilitate follow-up actions. I'm here this week to help make the links between the ARTEC's work and this working group. And the Secretariat mentioned the paper in front of us, providing information on progress with implementation of the 4 traditional knowledge indicators. and I look forward very much to hearing the discussions that ensue. There are two headline indicators in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework that are particularly relevant on traditional occupations, which is one of those four indicators, and on mobilization of data and thinking about how that links to traditional knowledge. There's also a binary indicator, which Substa 25 considered and edited, subject to further discussions at Substa 26 and COP16. And the ARTEG's meeting in December will take account of the discussions this week. Looking forward, there's a bunch of parallel work being undertaken by others, which we will integrate into the ARTEG's work. So there is, as well as listening to the discussions this week, we're working with the Financial Technical Expert Group, we're maintaining close liaison with UNEP WCMC, and making good use of linkages to other groups. Two more online and a further face-to-face meeting of the ARTEG are planned before providing a report to Substa 26. And the aim is to have a single draft decision going to COP16, which will bring together the recommendations arising from Substa 25, together with the recommendations that will arise from Substa 26. And if parties would find it useful, we could run one or more webinars to introduce people to the work that's been undertaken, with the aim of informing you before the discussions at Substa 26. Some key messages to nearly finish off with. We're making good progress, but there's still a lot to do to complete the very full mandate. The ARTEG is functioning well, with good engagement from all members. Lots of work is being done between the meetings. The Substa 25 focused on proposals for making the binary indicators categorical and for simplifying the questions that parties may be asked to answer in their national reports. Considerable progress is also being made on the headline indicators, and the document reporting on the face-to-face meeting in Montreal gives an overview. And the ARTEG is about halfway through its work. This is an ongoing process. I am, of course, happy to answer questions, but before I do so, Maria and I would like to offer thanks to all of the members of the ARTEG for their hard work and to the Secretariat for their excellent logistical and process support. Maria and I are meeting the Secretariat on a fortnightly basis to keep the process moving forwards. And I am happy, of course, to meet with interested parties and organisations this week if desired. And finally, a thank you to the translators and the technicians for helping to make this presentation possible. Thank you for your attention.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Thank you, James Osho-Maria. Distinguished delegate, the floor now is open for intervention on item 7. So, Australia, you have the first floor.
Chair, it was our understanding that IIFB would be going first.
Sorry, you are correct. Thanks for your recommendation. APLC? Okay.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. This is the statement of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. The IFB thanks the Secretariat for the preparation of the document 8J-12 6 Rev 1, which provides useful information on COP decisions, as well as an overview of work being undertaken with respect to the 4 traditional knowledge indicators. Under Agenda Item 7, Working Group 8J-12 is asked to review and update the 4 traditional knowledge indicators adopted by earlier COP decisions. These TK indicators have not been fully operationalized for application as a global indicator, but have already been used to guide community-based monitoring and reporting by initiatives such as the Indigenous Navigator, the Network on Customary Sustainable Use, the Elasha Network on Indigenous Peoples Global Partnership on Climate Change, Forests, and Sustainable Development, and by members of the IFB Working Group on Indicators, because of their high relevance for work at the community level. The discussions held so far on agenda items 3, 4, 5, and 6 on indigenous languages, progress in the implementation of the work program, knowledge management, as well as the new program of work, point to the cross-cutting nature of traditional knowledge across the KM Global Biodiversity Framework, which needs to be monitored through appropriate indicators. These discussions make evident that the new program of work is a central part of the Kunming-Montreal GBF, and as such, the indicators to monitor progress of its implementation should be embedded in the monitoring framework of the KM-GBF. The 4 traditional knowledge indicators already adopted by previous COP decisions should find a central place in the KM-GBF monitoring framework. We welcome the work under the ATEG and the progress made on binary indicators. But we also note with concern that there are no headline indicators for Target 22 and its various elements focused on outcomes on the ground. This is a critical gap that needs to be addressed given the cross-cutting nature of this target. We therefore propose the addition of a paragraph after paragraph 3, and paragraph 3 would read as follows. Invite Substa 26 to consider the addition of 2 headline indicators in the monitoring framework to fill gaps in relation to Target 22, namely, trends in land use change and land tenure in the traditional territories of indigenous peoples and local communities, and trends in the degree to which traditional knowledge and practices are respected through their full integration, safeguards, and the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities in the implementation of the strategic plan. In relation to this proposal, the IFB welcomes paragraph 6 that reads, requests the Secretariat to facilitate a scientific and technical review of the 4 traditional knowledge indicators and their suggested links with the headline, component, and complementary indicators of the monitoring framework, subject to the availability of resources, taking into account the work conducted by the ATEG for the Kunming GBF, and in consultation with the co-chairs of the expert group, and make the outcome available to the expert group and to the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice for consideration at its 26th meeting, and for further submission to the Conference of Parties at its 16th meeting. We seek support from parties for our proposals in the course of today's discussions. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Then I return to the floor to Australia because you were previous in the first in the list.
Thank you, Chair. Australia strongly supports the need for a robust and effective monitoring, reporting and review framework, and is strongly supportive of ensuring this framework is participatory and inclusive. As such, we support the intervention and text proposals by the IIFB for this agenda item. Delays in establishing indicators for the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity saw delayed progress on meeting its objectives and contributing to meaningful reporting on achievements. Australia wants to ensure that appropriate indicators are adopted as soon as practicable, drawing on efforts to date so that this is not repeated with reporting under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We want to ring the cowbell on our success and light up our achievements like fireflies. We recognise the important contribution of Indigenous peoples and local communities as integral to biodiversity management. Australia would like to see indicators that are aimed at considering activity-based participation of Indigenous people, that are more closely aligned to the objectives of the Convention, and that are developed with the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We have some amendments to improve clarity of the recommendations, and we will submit our proposed amendments to the Secretariat. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Democratic Republic of the Congo. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair, for giving me the floor. The Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to make this statement on behalf of the African Group. Africa thanks the Vice President of the Intersessional Group that has been working on 8J and the annex proposals on the Convention on Biodiversity for the wonderful, laudable work that's been done, and also for the schedule of meetings to come. Africa would like to thank also the Secretariat, for the work that's been done in order to allow us to have these documents, which are an excellent basis for exchange on these very important topics of biodiversity and cultural diversity, and including indicators for traditional knowledge. Africa welcomes the recognition of the important role that has been played by Indigenous peoples and local communities, and is being played today, in preserving biodiversity and in sustainable use of its resources, and the important link which exists between biodiversity and culture, and the importance of using indicators to raise awareness of traditional knowledge, specifically with regard to the work on the Convention on CBD. Africa recognizes the complexity of these different issues and the differing situations that exist amongst local communities and Indigenous peoples in different regions of the world and different countries. But for Africa, there is no elephant without ivory. There is no ivory without an elephant, and an elephant without ivory. So local communities and Indigenous peoples are one indivisible package. Trying to separate them would be basically like trying to separate or decide who's more important, which came first, the chicken or the egg. So we would request that local communities and Indigenous peoples remain inseparable, remain indivisible from the process, as we've seen already in the KMGBF and other parts of the Convention. Moreover, Africa would like to ensure that there is participation and fair and balanced consideration of the views of these groups, which are, again, not different groups, but one single entity. I thank you.
Merci. Now I give the floor to Canada.
Thank you, Chair. Canada expresses its appreciation for the efforts made to further develop the 4 traditional knowledge indicators. But in light of the newly adopted Coming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, we think our efforts are better placed on how to operationalize the monitoring framework of the GBF, and more specifically, the monitoring of Target 22. While Canada understands and has supported the use of the 4 traditional knowledge indicators for helping to track progress of the Working Group on 8J and parties on this issue, we would not support using these same 4 indicators as cross-cutting indicators of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We have adopted the GBF monitoring framework and need to focus our efforts at finding an effective way of monitoring Target 22. A proposal to have cross-cutting indicators would result in reopening the monitoring framework, which would not be prudent at this point. We will submit our amendments in writing to the Secretariat. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Canada. Now I give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Japan appreciates the strong efforts made by the Secretariat to ensure collaboration with the relevant UN organizations and partners, especially the long-standing collaboration with UNESCO. We consider that this task should be carried out within the scope and mandate of CBD and without duplication with existing work and programs of other relevant organizations and agencies. In particular, the work led by UNESCO or other organizations should be implemented in line with the joint work plan stated as Task 2A and 2B of Decision COP 15/22. As for the binary indicators, Japan understands that the binary indicators have been proposed as complementary or supplementary indicators in the form of yes, no, or such questions to help us to measure the progress of the targets for which it is difficult to set headline indicators. Even if they are supplementary in nature, the binary indicators are required to be reported by parties through national reports. Therefore, we would like to propose that the indicators should be clear, minimal, and concise question items options to minimize the burden of parties and make them efficient and effective. Japan would like to note the importance of consistency of work among related fora and processes with regards to consideration of indicators, in particular at SAPSTA and ATEC. We should avoid duplications and should not prejudge discussions at the related meetings and processes, but rather follow closely with the ongoing discussion regarding the identification and proposals of indicators for monitoring of the progress of the KMGBF implementation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Japan. Now I give the floor to European Union.
Thank you very much, Chair. The European Union and its member states thank the Secretariat and the multiple organizations of indigenous peoples and local communities, such as the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the Forest Peoples Program, and others, for their dedicated work in developing indicators related to traditional knowledge, land use and tenure, linguistic diversity, and the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. The indicators for Target 22 and Target 23 on representation and participation in decision-making and gender equality in the implementation of the framework are of great value to the benefit of the monitoring of the KM-GBF. The European Union and its member states have systematically acknowledged the importance of a robust monitoring framework and welcome the work carried out in this regard. The European Union and its member states thank the work of the ATEG on indicators and will appreciate their further contributions toward filling critical gaps, including, in particular, concerning traditional knowledge indicators where necessary. Therefore, the European Union and its member states, in principle, support the draft recommendation in the updated document, that is document 12/6/Rev1, especially the timing set up to consider the advances in Substa 26 for submission to COP16, with the aim of adopting a complete set of indicators as part of the monitoring framework of the KMGBF. The European Union and its member states encourage all actors engaged in developing cross-cutting indicators for a human rights-based approach and indicators related to targets 22 and 23, and we urge collaboration, including with the joint program of work on the links between cultural and biological diversity and its element 5 on traditional knowledge indicators. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The next speaker is South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. South Africa supports the statement made by the DRC on behalf of Africa. South Africa takes note of progress made by the ad hoc technical expert group on indicators. We also recognize the need to fully operationalize the traditional knowledge indicators with clearly agreed scope and coverage, methodology, metrics, and custodian agencies. In reviewing and updating the 4 adopted traditional knowledge indicators, South Africa has the following comments. For indicator A, we are of the view that focusing solely on number of speakers may not fully capture the depth and richness of knowledge within a language. Given the complex systems of knowledge and culture developed and accumulated by these languages over the years, their disappearance would amount to losing a kind of cultural treasure. It would also deprive users of the rich diversity, the value the linguistics communities add to the ecological, economic, and socio-cultural spectrum. For indicator B, South Africa believes that trends in land use change and land tenure in the traditional territories may not encompass the quality of land and impacts of changes on biodiversity. And this is something that we believe can be explored further in the updating and reviewing of the indicators. For indicator C, we are of the view that trends in the practices of traditional occupations might focus on certain visible or more easily measurable occupations and not cover all traditional practices. The indicator, therefore, should also cover an understanding of the spiritual, social, and ecological aspects or significance of these practices. Practices of traditional occupations are multitudes in the fields of traditional health practices, indigenous foods, traditional cultural expressions, agriculture, etc., etc. We'll submit our comments in writing. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next speaker is Brazil.
Thank you, Chair. Brazil is overall supportive of the proposed recommendations under document 12/6/Rev1. We would highlight the need to further develop the headline indicator under Target 9 in order to achieve a better understanding of the social, economic, and environmental benefits of biodiversity. We would further stress that the qualifier traditional under the expression traditional occupations requires an adequate consideration in order to capture different context-specific situations as the sustainable livelihoods of IPLCs and the innovations and practices that underpin them evolve over time. Moreover, we would highlight the need to ensure and enhance the transparency and inclusivity of community-based monitoring and information systems, and to fully engage IPLCs in the management of those systems, including by promoting and implementing community-based monitoring and information systems in developing countries. Enhanced international cooperation is also needed to address the financial, technical, technological, and capabilities constraints that undermine developing countries' capacity to support those monitoring and information systems. Finally, our comments to the proposed binary indicators presented during Subset 25 remain valid, as we understand we need a more nuanced approach towards some of the elements outlined in Target 22. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Norway.
Thank you, Chair. Norway stresses the critical importance of the engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities and of taking into consideration their traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices in reviewing progress in the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We also recognize that data collection and disaggregation related to Indigenous peoples pose unique challenges in terms of developing both data and global comparative purposes and data useful at micro level for Indigenous peoples, as well as the intermediate level of national monitoring and reporting. We fully support the COP15 decision adopting the monitoring framework for the Kunming-Montreal GBF, and note that the monitoring framework adopted at COP15 include a global level indicator based on binary responses on target 22 that will capture progress towards the target via questions in the national reports, in addition to links to headline indicator 9.2 and 21.1. We recognize and welcome that the Kunming-Montreal GBF identifies the contributions and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities as a cross-cutting consideration and implementation of all goals and targets of the framework, and we welcome continued work on indicators to capture this dimension. We welcome the request to the Secretariat to facilitate a scientific and technical review of the 4 traditional knowledge indicators and their suggested link to the headline component and complementary indicators of the monitoring framework. We also support the invitation to the ad hoc technical expert group on indicators and the SUBSTA to take into account the submissions received on the traditional knowledge indicators in their work, respecting their mandate and the decision from COP15 on the monitoring framework. We thank the ad hoc technical expert group on indicators for their very important and substantial work done so far and look forward to reviewing the work at SUBSTA 26 in May. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Norway. Then next speaker is Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, Egypt would like to thank the Secretariat for preparation of this very, very important issue that are related to these indicators and the link between both cultural and diversity as well. Having said that, both of them, without biodiversity, there is no cultural heritage because you use all of these biodiversity components in some way or another. Therefore, Egypt strongly supports statement given by DRC, as well as a statement given by South Africa on all of these indicators. My main problem still exists since even SUBSTA 25. We still have critical gaps exist, and we hope these gaps can respond to this very important issue that deal with indigenous people and local communities. If we solve these gaps, at least we will be able to know where we stand and where are we heading in a way that we can see how these indicators can be used in assessing progress that have been done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next. Sorry, it's Mexico.
Thank you very much, Chair. We would also like to thank the Secretariat for presenting us with this new document on indicators. We consider that information traceability is very important for decision-making at a community level and also at the government level. The safeguard of indigenous peoples' heritage should be an international commitment toward preserving traditional knowledge as well as practice and other indigenous traditions. recognizing the fundamental role of the subjects of public law in the promotion of biodiversity is very important. We recognize that following the KMGBF with indicators of various natures such as complementary, binary, and other types of indicators should continue to be developed, and we should have indicators that indicate traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. Although there's limited data, we believe it's necessary to have adequate sources in order to determine land tenancy. We also believe it's possible to determine a series of key questions to determine a methodology on the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. In order to put indicators into practice on the areas of traditional knowledge, we suggest to analyze how the group of indicators can contribute to the follow-up framework. Follow-up systems should also be set up in order to follow up on the various initiatives. The full and effective participation of indigenous peoples must be considered as a transversal or horizontal indicator. National focal points for Article 8J should also support government in order to ensure the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples in the update, follow-up, presentation of reports, and presentation of strategies, as well as for national action plans in the area of biodiversity. We also believe that national data systems and knowledge systems of the Native people are important knowledge repositories. We believe in the need to strengthen information and monitoring based on communities, and this at every level. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Next speaker is Saudi Arabia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية أشكر الفريق العامل على كافة.
Thank you, Chair. We'd like to thank the working group for the efforts undertaken in the preparation of this document and working with all the parties. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in the framework of our efforts for the implementation of biological diversity and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, give great importance to traditional knowledge and ensuring the participation of local communities in the safeguard of biodiversity as well as the environment in general. We are working with a number of different actors who came together within the framework of the National Commission for Science, which represents the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia within the ambit of UNESCO. We have been updating a number of activities aimed at strengthening the interaction between cultural diversity and biological diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I saw the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You request the floor again, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chair, for giving me the floor again. For the first time, DRC spoke on behalf of the African group. And so now I'm taking the floor the second time to speak in my national capacity. Now, to begin, the DRC supports the statement that has been made by the DRC on behalf of the African group and aligns itself with the position of South Africa and Egypt expressed. Indeed, the DRC is a great and large country, some 450 different ethnic groups, and this includes the Pygmy people and indigenous peoples, and they have different qualifications depending where they are located in the country. And this is a really excellent diversity. This includes diversity in local communities. They all have an unconditional attachment and respect for the forest, which is their biological resource. Now, they have a traditional knowledge, and we recognize that there is an undeniable link between preserving biological diversity and cultural diversity. Yesterday, Chair, we saw that culture was dying, and this not without regret, because if culture were to die, then biodiversity would die as well. This is, of course, not the wish of the Convention on Biodiversity, and even less that of the Global Framework on Biodiversity, the KMBF. So that's why the DRC sees that there is an alarming lack of indicators on the access of indigenous peoples and local communities to different resources and different mechanisms of financing. Given that the poverty of these peoples is a great threat, which is non-negligible, to biodiversity, we should continually fight to have an indicator on indigenous peoples' access and local communities' access to different financing mechanisms. An access which would allow them to manage in a constant and sustainable way genetic resources, biological resources, and also to continue to document and promote traditional knowledge for the well-being of biodiversity and nature and all peoples. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Nigeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nigeria commends the efforts made to come up with updated indicators on traditional knowledge. Nigeria aligns with the submission by DRC, South Africa, and Egypt. The indicators have substantially captured the degree of integration of indigenous and local communities. However, indicators must be clear and more specific to capture the quality of involvement of these groups. Indicator 4, on the trends in the degree to which knowledge and practices are respected. Their full integration, safeguards in the national implementation of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. This looks a bit vague, as participation could just be being floor members than having strategic involvement. I believe as we go on, refinement of indicators will continue for practicability and be more realistic. Thank you.
Thank you. Next floor gave to China.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I thank the architect for extensive and efficient work and Secretariat for organizing this organization on this important topic. We all know that the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has 4 long-term goals and 23 targets. Therefore, formulation of the indicators for these targets should take into account the content and indicator should be focused on components closely related to diversity so as to ensure the effective evaluation of the progress of implementation of the framework and provide guidance for the parties to carry out the relevant work. In addition, the indicators should take into account the situation of different countries and give more weight to traditional knowledge. Indicators should not be too complex and should not add too much burden to the data collection of the parties. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly support the statement made by DRC on behalf of the Africa Group. It is the belief of my delegation that respect, preservation, and maintaining knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological resources is critical for the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. And therefore, we thank the Secretariat and the architect for the work in the updated indicators. In that regard, my delegation believes that on the indicators for effective participation of IPLC, it is important to ensure that issues of enhancing balance between the participation of indigenous people and that of local communities within the convention itself is also reflected. The interlinkages between culture and biodiversity also needs to be further strengthened within the indicators. Specifically, Eswatini believes that the scientific and technical review, as called upon by paragraph 6, needs to take into consideration issues of tradition and spirituality associated with traditional knowledge, which might not be specifically or scientifically represented. It is therefore important to ensure that issues related to such aspects are also taken into consideration in the scientific review. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Next is Uganda.
Thank you, Chair. Uganda would like to thank the ATEG for the discussions that led to the compilation of this detailed report on these indicators. We support the submission of DRC on behalf of the African group, as well as Egypt, Namibia, and Eswatini for their views on these indicators. Uganda believes that for indicators to be effective, they have to be simplified, and they have to include metrics that are easy to measure. On indicator 1, indicator A, we believe that it would be a good thing to have two sub-indicators rather than leaving it as it is, where the measurement is for two items. So we believe that we could have a sub-indicator 1 that measures the trends of linguistic diversity, and sub-indicator 2 that measures the number of speakers of indigenous languages. We also believe that it would be a good thing to have this indicator also cover aspects of gender disaggregation. On indicator B, we believe also that we could have two measurements here, one measuring the trends in land use change and another measuring the trends in land tenure in the traditional territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. This is important because land use change and land tenure are two different and separate things. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I saw no request from the parties. Now I give the floor to women.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Cecilia Githaiga, speaking on behalf of the CBD Women Caucus. We reiterate our request expressed before COP15, at COP15, and at SABSTO 25. To have headline indicators for all targets, in particular target 22 and 23. We also ask that all indicators should be disaggregated following intersectional perspective. And we also express our deep concern with the binary indicators methodology. In this context, we express our support for IIFB statement, and we propose that our discussions support the development of an inclusive, strong, balanced, and fully accountable monitoring framework. Concretely, we propose additions to the text for coherence in the following recommendations. In the section on the working group 8J, we propose at paragraph 1, add reference to not only community-based but also community-led monitoring and information systems. At paragraph 2, to add reference to free, prior, and informed consent. In the same paragraph 2, to align the language to the exact wording of target 22 regarding participation, and include the words full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender-responsive representation. To add a new paragraph between paragraph 3 and 4, as follows. Stresses the need of gender disaggregation for all indicators related to the GBF, including the 4 traditional knowledge indicators as indicated in the Gender Plan of Action in Objective 3.2 to strengthen the evidence-based understanding and analysis of gender-related impacts of the GBF, including insights from traditional knowledge on all women and girls from indigenous peoples and law communities. At paragraph 4, we propose add women and youth, and further on the section on recommendations to COP, at paragraph 2, after the words for traditional knowledge indicators, add the words with full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender responsive representation and participation of all indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as women and youth. And in the same paragraph, delete the word subject to availability of funding. We kindly request parties to support our proposals. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, according to the rule, we would like to request any party to support women's statement.
There's one.
Dominican Republic.
Unfortunately, the interpreters are not getting any sound from the Dominican Republic.
Y la diversidad cultural. Realmente quiero, más que nada, dar un mensaje global que conecte.
More than anything, Chair, I would like to send a message that would connect the important members, because today we are addressing the inextricable connection between biological biodiversity and cultural diversity. More specifically, in the review and updating of indicators for traditional knowledge. The wealth of our planet, Chairman, is based not only on biodiversity, but also in the various cultures that flourish within that biodiversity. Therefore, any change in bioindicators should take that into account. In every system, we find communities whose practices and whose knowledge have evolved in a manner that is harmonious with nature. This traditional knowledge, Chair, conveyed from one generation to the next, are not merely relics of the past. These indicators are living tools for a sustainable future which we wish to build. Converting sustainability into culture is a sentence that should become a motto for us throughout the world, reminding us that each step toward the conservation of biodiversity is also a step toward enriching our own cultural heritage. By reviewing and updating the 4 indicators adopted for traditional knowledge, our responsibility is to ensure that these indicators reflect not just the conservation of biodiversity, but also the strengthening of the communities who are the actual guardians of this biodiversity. We should unite our efforts to create a future where biodiversity and cultural diversity not only coexist alongside each other, but also enrich each other mutually, tracing in this manner a path that will lead to sustainable and equitable development. Thank you for your attention. And as always, we will continue working together for a better world.
With the Secretary for the next procedure. Okay, just to have efficient of the intervention, we have some requests from the floor. I wonder if we need the 3 support for the women's statement. I wonder if Democratic Republic of Congo and Colombia, Chile, and Guatemala, you are supporting women. If yes, you can withdraw your request. We will take note of your support. Okay, so if no, we continue with from the request list, Democratic Republic of Congo, please.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for giving me the floor. The DRC is taking the floor because it wasn't listed as one of the countries that wanted to support the women's group, but we did want to do that, and we recall well that the statement from the women's group was mentioned in other previous meetings of the convention as well, and we had supported it at that time. I thank you.
Thank you. It's clear. Now, next speaker is Morocco.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Morocco also supports the statement that has been made by the Women's Forum. Thank you very much. I'm making a statement here on behalf of the Kingdom of Morocco. Morocco supports the DRC on behalf of the African group. We also welcome what's been done by the Secretariat of the Convention of the CBD. We thank you for the quality of the documents that you've submitted, and also we support hashtag for the work that's been done. Morocco supports the draft recommendations on the whole. We also believe that the indicators from other targets of the IGF integrate the efforts of indigenous peoples and local communities well. We thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Colombia.
Thank you very much, Chair. Colombia would like to thank the Secretariat and the ATEG for the work on indicators, and we'd like to encourage them to take due consideration of national processes so that we can have indicators that will be measurable at a national level, but also at a local level. This is not just of interest to the government, but also of interest to all the other stakeholders, that is to say, the indigenous peoples and local communities. Colombia is one of the most advanced countries in terms of land adjudication to indigenous peoples and local communities. For this reason, it is important to underscore that these stakeholders have approximately 30% of the territory, thus contributing trends to the second indicator as far as land tenancy is concerned. On the links between biological diversity and cultural diversity, Colombia would like to refer to cultural and linguistic diversity of the 115 people and Black or Afro-Colombian communities, the Palenqueros, the Rom, the peasant population, and the importance of an integral and holistic view on the right to territory within the concept of biodiversity. Therefore, we consider indicator A as very appropriate since it points toward the diversity of linguistic trends and also to the numbers of people who speak indigenous language. In this connection, we would like to suggest a link between the processes of the CBD, but also other conventions such as the Climate Change Convention and other indicators such as those that are present in the SDG list, and also other multilateral instruments in this area. Colombia considers fundamental to have participation in indigenous peoples and local communities in all spaces established by the CBD, and in particular for the global framework and its monitoring framework. We believe that strengthening the dialogue between SUBSTA and the EHEG is very important in order to have a dialogue of knowledge and an intercultural dialogue. We'd like to underscore the importance of the indicators proposed and built from the indigenous peoples and local communities level, having them associated in the monitoring framework. We would also like to congratulate the Organization of Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities organizations and other organizations such as the women's and youth organizations as well. We firmly believe in the need to work jointly and to participate in the drafting of indicators. We would like also to encourage that these indicators be integrated in the official information systems and be used to write reports on the country's progress toward the framework. Colombia also supports community support so that indigenous and local communities, youth and women, can also report on the follow-up of the goals established. We recommend establishing in the Substa 26 a link between Substa and Article 8J. We would also like to encourage work on targets 22 and 23, and we would like to support the statement made by Women's Caucus. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you. Next is Uganda.
Thank you, Chair. Uganda would like to record our support for the statement by the Women Caucus. Thank you, Chair.
Next is Madagascar.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chair, for giving us the floor. Madagascar thanks the Secretariat for the work that's been done on indicators, and Madagascar aligns itself with the position that has been voiced by the African group as well as that of the DRC. Madagascar was one of the first African countries to have ensured the effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, taking in mind their traditional practices in our consideration of biodiversity. Now, how information from local communities is something that's not easy to integrate because the answer is because of a lack of financing and resources. So that's why we need to improve those two indicators. I think it would be necessary here to bolster the capacity of local communities and all actors in the drafting of the indicators in domestic systems, and also to build the space for these indicators. We need to have capacity building programs on these indicators in our domestic systems, which could take the format of, for example, guidelines or a guidebook. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Comoros.
Merci, Monsieur le...
Thank you very much, sir. The Union of the Comores would like to thank the Swiss government for having organized this assembly, and also thank the Secretariat for the excellent folder that has been submitted. We support the statement that has been made by the Women's Forum, and we also support the statement that has been made by the DRC on behalf of the African group. We congratulate the Secretariat on the excellent preparation of documents, the work done on indicators as well. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Haiti.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Haiti would like to thank the government of Switzerland and also the Secretariat of the Convention for the organization of this very important conference. First and foremost, Haiti supports the statement that has been made by the Women's Forum. Haiti believes that there is an inexhaustible resource of knowledge, traditional practices, traditional use of Haitian biodiversity, which is possessed by the general community, the general population, and the local community specifically. That could help us to better understand our agreements, which is underpinned by science. The knowledge and know-how that is traditional in nature and which is held by local communities on biodiversity is something that is passed down from generation to generation in a non-systematic way. With rural exodus, of course, moving of these local communities. This is something that it risks being lost over time. So indicators on traditional knowledge must be non-equivocal and clear. They must take into account the different links with cultural diversity as well. In conclusion, we support the creation of a standing subsidiary body under 8J and would request that we mobilize more resources to preserve cultural diversity, which is a key part and parcel of the preservation of biodiversity. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Next one is Cuba.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd just like to address two of the elements that have been discussed. First of all, as other delegations have stated, we believe that these indicators should be transparent, simple, flexible, but they should be truly integrated within the official indicator systems used by countries. This is very important in order to assess the effectiveness of these indicators in terms of measuring our progress towards the goals we're trying to achieve. Secondly, we'd like to point at the need for these indicators to also take natural circumstances into national circumstances into account. In this regard, we are concerned with indicator number 1 for countries such as ours, where we only speak one language, and therefore this indicator actually does not really reveal what the participation of local communities has been, because it simply does not apply. That is why we believe the indicators should be flexible and in keeping with national circumstances, so that these are duly integrated indicators. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Land Coalition.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Eva Hershaw, and I'm the Data and Land Monitoring Lead of the International Land Coalition. We are the largest and most diverse global land rights network, with more than 300 members across the world, ranging from UN agencies to small and community-based organizations. We'd like to begin by saying that we fully support the statements that have been read by IAFB and the Women's Caucus. ILC has been working for the better part of the last 6 years to monitor trends in land governance and tenure, for diverse types of tenure by sex, and to identify the data sources, official, complementary, and community-based, that are available to support the monitoring of these trends. With land tenure being recognized as one of the 4 TK indicators, or a component of one, ILC has provided input for their review, as mentioned in the document that's underpinning this discussion. We've provided an overview of global initiatives that are monitoring land tenure of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as a snapshot of available data sets. As further outlined in the document, we noted that SDG Indicator 142 on land tenure, defined as having documentation and perceived tenure security, has an established, a UN-endorsed methodology, but it lacks data that's specific to Indigenous peoples and local communities. In our submission, we mentioned that we have convened an informal working group. It includes the land tenure team at FAO, as well as several data collectors, such as the Indigenous Navigator, the Rights and Resources Initiatives, Prindex, and Landmark, among others. And we're working to co-develop a contextualized land tenure indicator for IPs and LCs. We have a preliminary methodology for the indicator that will be ready and shared at latest by SABSTA 26. The methodology is standard but flexible and provides space for official data if it were available and suitable, as well as community-based monitoring information systems. For many of the variables in question, good global data coverage has already been achieved. We look forward to engaging further with the program of work on the links between biological and cultural diversity, as well as with the Secretariat, with IAFB, and any interested parties or organizations on the matter. We are presenting further detail on the methodology at a side event at lunchtime. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So I see no more requests for the floor. So Now, after hearing your interventions, I feel that we have some consensus on a draft recommendation. With this in mind, I will prepare a conference room paper with the help of the Secretary, and I would like to remind you to ensure you have uploaded your written statement. Before we take up Agenda 8, let's take a few minutes break to get ready to address the next agenda item. 5 minutes?
Just stay in the room. 1 minute.
Oh, 1 minute in the room, sorry. 1 minute in the room. So there is a request, forget it? There is a request, so forget it. Oh, 可以
Let me grab you a
Yeah,
bottle
yeah.
of water.
We are co-chair.
No, I got one already, but I shouldn't drink anymore.
Could we maybe switch so that if you're chairing the next,
Yes.
Can we switch? Can we switch?
Can I sit next to Olivia?
Yeah, sure, sure. You need his assistant.
Oh. Okay. Mr. Dorian. Yes, introduce.
Hi. Hey, how are you?
I come in. Nice to meet you.
Sorry to make you switch.
No, I appreciate it. It'll be better, actually, for this one.
Good afternoon, everyone. Shall we start? We'll be starting on item 8 on the recommendations of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I will now give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce the item. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Shh. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Under this item, the working group will be invited to consider the recommendation arising from the 20th and 21st and 22nd sessions of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues pertaining to the Convention. The Secretariat has issued a note on recommendation of the Permanent Forum to the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD-WG8j-12/7, containing a concise update on recent recommendation of the Permanent Forum, not yet considered by the working group, and an update on previous recommendation made to the Convention and draft recommendation for the consideration of the working group. A draft recommendation is provided in section 4 to assist the working group with this task. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I have the honor of introducing Mr. Dario Mejia, Chairperson of for the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, who will provide an insightful introduction on to the recommendations put forward by the Permanent Forum to address the work of the Convention. Mr. Mejia, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would also like to send my very special greetings to the Secretariat, and I'd also like to greet all parties and delegations of Indigenous peoples, and also the delegations from the local communities, the representatives, the observers. Greetings to all. Thank you very much to the special working group, the open-ended group on Article 8J, for giving us the possibility of conducting a dialogue here this morning. And before we present the recommendations, I would like to just state that the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Matters is a subsidiary body with the mandate of examining issues of interest to Indigenous peoples in the areas of economic, social, and cultural development, as well as on the environment, education, and health, and human rights. Dear friends, it is always very important to have a retrospective view on some events, although sometimes very briefly. In this particular case, I would like to refer to two substantial items where states have reached an international consensus in the context of their dialogue with Indigenous peoples. The first of these is the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the second item is the establishment of special mechanisms for helping such states to develop as effectively as possible the recognition and implementation of Indigenous peoples' rights in the various different areas and various different places. These are the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Matters, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Both of these consensus were achieved by the states as a humble proof of progressive or gradual advance of cohabitation in the face of the historical challenges that we are all faced with. It is also true that other platforms and working groups have been set up on the basis of different thematic challenges and also the way in which these affect Indigenous peoples. In any case, this has been a joint undertaking between the states and the Indigenous peoples, regardless of whether the scenarios or the hypotheses or the situations are different for reasons that need not be explained. As regards the Permanent Forum and its work, there are several of its recommendations that have been welcomed and that have in turn brought about changes, which in themselves are insufficient but must be recognized as favorable and therefore important. For example, very recently, we have achieved the establishment of a decade on Indigenous languages. Also, there's been the recommendation number 39 on Indigenous women and young girls that's been adopted. And then some intergovernmental fora and other fora and summits have recognized Indigenous peoples rights as something that needs to be recognized at an institutional level or represented by people that they have freely chosen. It is important also to point out that as international law develops gradually, indigenous peoples have also been adjusting their working systems on the basis of the different challenges that have been coming up. For example, the political agreement by states that was adopted by consensus in the 77th session of the General Assembly through the resolution on indigenous peoples' rights was updated into the UN system, and the mention was made that indigenous people should be written with capital letters for the words indigenous or peoples when referring to languages, capitals, etc., and also when referring to indigenous women. The Permanent Forum would like to recognize and welcome and thank the states and international organizations that work on policies related to indigenous peoples, and in particular those who adopt measures that are based on the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. In the case of the CBD, the Permanent Forum recognizes the efforts of the parties aiming to recognize indigenous peoples' rights and to do this jointly with a series of international guidelines, such as the Montreal Biodiversity Framework and also the Voluntary Financing Mechanism. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to refer to Recommendation 85 of the 21st session of the Forum. That position has also been supported by two other United Nations mechanisms providing a mandate on the right of indigenous peoples' rights. As a consequence, this year, we are publicly stating before the member states and other UN agencies a communication on the subject that the rights of indigenous peoples should not be bunched up together as an indefinite group of communities that may have some differing rights and interests. Therefore, we would like to encourage the abandonment of the term indigenous peoples and local communities as if it were a single entity or a single subject. Let me go into some details. Our position should not be interpreted as a form of discrimination or opposition to any particular group or to any particular local community. Neither is this position a legal discussion regarding the existence or not of a given subject or group, regardless of how it is called, nor regardless of its own legal standing. What it is neither it is an exclusive recommendation focusing on other entities or processes or on UN entities. As we have already stated, we have sent a note to the different United Nations organizations that have responded favorably to our request or to our recommendation. And last of all, I would like to point out that this recommendation does not necessarily entail a review or modification of the text of the convention. This recommendation just looks at the working methods. Ultimately, it is an attempt to strengthen the relevance of the implementation of indigenous peoples' rights in the overall context of the convention's work. For example, the acronym IPLC, as well as the plaques that are used in the context of this convention, should specifically identify indigenous peoples separately, as per the social groups that are participating in this deliberation. Or when subjects or commemorations or data are addressed that correspond exclusively to indigenous peoples, they should not be added into other entities, but on the contrary. When it's a matter of data or commemoration of other groups, it is not necessary to include indigenous peoples in such documents either, of course. We should bear in mind that we are here in the international organizations where everything has importance. We should therefore avoid for procedural injustice to take root and become a structural injustice. I would also like to point out that among the 3 mechanisms that have mandates in the area of indigenous peoples' rights, we will do a self-convocation of a workshop on this subject next year in 2024. In the next few days, we'll be sending out invitations. Your Excellencies, the Permanent Forum would like to recommend a conference of the parties that after having examined the Secretariat's note on the Permanent Forum's recommendations on the subject of indigenous peoples' rights and also on biological diversity, we believe it should request the Secretariat to set up an ad hoc expert group on the implications and consequences of confusing indigenous peoples with other social groups within the overall global framework of the Kunming-Montreal Convention. And it should also undertake specific actions in order to avoid the two being conflated or confused with each other. We would also like to support the ad hoc group and urge them to consider indigenous peoples and the 3 UN mechanisms that are related to indigenous peoples. I'm referring to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, the expert mechanism, and also the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as United Nations entities that have an interest in this matter. I also recommend that the Permanent Forum be informed on the results of such a meeting. We would also like to request the Secretariat to produce a report that would facilitate the implementation of the framework in coordination with the UN work on the rights of indigenous peoples. We would also like to invite the parties to study the report of the ad hoc expert group at its next session. Your Excellencies, thank you very much for listening to my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Mejia. Thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is now for interventions on item 8, and I give the floor to IFB. The floor is yours. IPLC. 1.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Onel Inanadinia Masardule. I am from the Kuna Nation, Panama. So on behalf of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, I have the pleasure to present this statement on the vital agenda concerning the recommendation of the United Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It is imperative to recognize the broader context of our deliberations. In relation to the recommendation of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the IFV takes into account the indigenous peoples and local community work together on issues of mutual interest and common concern. However, indigenous people have distinct, unique, and specific identities and rights. So IFV therefore recommends that the Secretariat of the Convention of Biological Diversity complies with decisions 12/14/2012 on local communities and decisions 12/12F on the use of the term indigenous peoples and local communities, has appropriates and takes concrete steps in appropriate documents, draft recommendations that clearly identify the difference between local communities and indigenous peoples. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, IFB, for expressing your concerns in your proposal. European Union, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. I am speaking on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The European Union and its member states take note of the recommendations and appreciate some of the reflections from the 20th, 21st, and 22nd sessions of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We support the draft recommendations by the Secretariat and note with satisfaction that Section C of the framework explicitly highlights a human rights-based approach and the necessity to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, aligning with relevant national legislation and international instruments, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Human Rights Law, as referred to in the Permanent Forum's recommendations, paragraph number 87 of the 21st session. Further, the new program of work on Article 8J and related provisions on Indigenous peoples and local communities to be established in this meeting is proposing a specific elements that deals with direct access to financial resources for biodiversity conservation for Indigenous peoples and local communities, and it is also proposing institutional arrangements that allow for the effective and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples and of local communities in all processes of the Convention. These are examples that align with the recommendations expressed in paragraph 28 of the 22nd session of the Permanent Forum. We'd like to encourage the Secretariat to continue engaging constructively with the Permanent Forum. Close interaction will be crucial during the process of implementing the new program of work. Thank you very much, Chair.
And I see a request from seat 226. Could you please identify yourself?
Gracias, señora presidenta. Y aprovecho.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since it's the first time that I take the floor, I would like to apologize because I will be referring to a important subject. I'd also like to congratulate my dear brother Mejia on his statement on the subject of the Permanent Forum. I'd also like to congratulate you, Madam Chair, for the excellent job you're doing, and also congratulate the co-chair for assisting us in this important work. Madam Chair, we have joined in the work that's undertaken. We are part of the Amazonian Network for Cooperation, and we have closely followed and joined in the work on various occasions that has been undertaken by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Questions. And Madam Chair, I would just like to say that there is a forum called the Permanent United Nations Forum on Afro-Descendants. And we have discussed with our colleagues the fact that this permanent forum, when it is named at the CBD, is not recognized as Afro-descendants. It recognizes local communities instead. So, Madam Co-Chair, we have our work cut out for us in the future, although no, I'm not looking into the crystal ball. But what is true is that the program that we are studying here and the issue at hand at this very moment do have to do with a program that aims at the year 2030. So we are going to also have a Vision 2050. So I would like to say that I support the decision. I certainly welcome the decision that is being taken by the Permanent Forum. I think it is a decision that has already been made. However, we believe that the subjects related with the CBD and that in particular have to do with the innovations, traditional knowledge, etc., the group 8 known as 8J, does have a clearly defined framework as refers the subjects at hand. And let me conclude, ma'am. I am going to send you my text in writing, and I would like to thank you, Madam, for your understanding. Thank you, Madam Chair. It was in the heat of the moment that we brought up the subject. Thank you.
No, we thank you and we note your support for the statement that was made by the Permanent Forum. I also see a request from Observers 9. Could you please identify yourself and the organization that you're representing?
Thank you, Chair. Speaking on behalf of the International Indian Treaty Council and the Indigenous World Association, who collectively represent over 100 indigenous nations, traditional governments, and organizations in North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Concerning the recommendations of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we support the statement by the IIFB and present the following additional proposals for consideration. Add in Section 3 a new chapter titled Recommendations emanating from the 18th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, with language enunciating the relevant recommendations made at that session. Also add in Section 3 a new chapter titled Statement by United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, with text emanating the language of that statement. Include to paragraph 40 the following edits. Add a new recommendation. We welcome the July 2030 statement by the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In paragraph 40.1, welcome the observers, the observations, and recommendations emanating from the 20th, 21st, and 22nd sessions of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and request an update from the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues regarding the current status of the 12th recommendation from its 18th session. We respectfully request party support for these proposals, and we'll send our presentation in writing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to see some support from parties for this statement. Is there any support from any parties to support the statement that was just made? I don't see any right now. I think. Please give us a moment as I consult with the Secretariat. Denmark, you have the floor.
It's working now. Thank you. Thank you for the floor. On behalf of the Kingdom of Denmark, we wishes to state very clearly that we attach great importance to the issues related to the rights of indigenous peoples as enshrined in the UNDRIP and as put forward by the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues at their 22nd session in 2023. In the recommendations in paragraph 25 and 75, and as recommended by the just referenced paper by the three UN mechanisms of indigenous peoples in their letter of 16th October. I will not quote the recommendations 25 and 75 and 25 here, but they will be part of our statement that I will upload. Further, in the context of the BBNJ agreement, the agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, recently agreed, such a separation between indigenous peoples and local communities is indeed reflected in the preambular text as well as in Article 7K of that agreement. Again, you will find the text in writing in our statement. I will not read them out loud here to save time. Last but not least, also in the context of the UNGA 78 biodiversity resolution being negotiated right now, such a position of separation, i.e. to use language like indigenous peoples as well as local communities instead of indigenous peoples and local communities, has also been defended. Consequently, and to summarize, the Kingdom of Denmark wishes to state that we continue to favor the welcoming and the endorsement of these two recommendations by the Forum, recommendations 25 and 75, put forward by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Denmark. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Canada takes note and welcomes further discussions at the CBD on the recommendations emanating from the 20th, 21st, and 22nd sessions of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which relate to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Canada. I see there are no more requests on the floors. Oh, Colombia. Colombia, just in time. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Colombia would like to support the recommendations that have been put forward by the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples concerning the need to link and strengthen the members of indigenous peoples and local communities, and also underline the importance to establish links between the CBD and the Climate Change Convention and other environmental initiatives that are aligned with the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Objectives. Thank you.
Colombia, Brazil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Brazil thanks the Secretariat for preparing document 12/7. We take note of the recommendations of the 20th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and we appreciate the ongoing engagement of the Permanent Forum with the work under the Convention. We would like to stress the need to enhance compliance with the Nagoya Protocol and national ABS legislation to prevent biopiracy, including the misuse and misappropriation of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, including DSI. As some of the recommendations from the Permanent Forum would require in-depth consultations and would need to be assessed against the backdrop of the Convention's mandate, existing working streams, and different national legislations, we would prefer to take note of those recommendations at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. Can I close the floor for the, yes. All right, thank you, everyone. Giving the floor to DRC. The floor is yours.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Co-Chair, for the floor. With regard to item 8, which we are currently considering, you saw that there is a certain level of intimacy in the cell, in the room, which in fact is something that speaks words. The silence speaks louder than words. Because the thing is that, Madam Co-Chair, there are certain things that we want to validate here, but which somehow have divergences, separation, differences, which only might exacerbate latent conflict which exists amongst or between different groups, which were only yesterday seen as being marginalized or different. The position of Africa this morning, let us recall, was to say that for one single action which would be aligned, concerted, efficient between different groups of people, it is important to consider that indigenous people and local communities are one single, indivisible unity, inseparable in nature. And that is where we will really make gains in terms of ensuring participation and ensure that it will be balanced, fair, equitable, just, and which will allow us to arrive at the objectives that we have set for ourselves and the results that we wish to achieve. Otherwise, it would be that we want one thing and only get the opposite. We would be as if constructing with materials of deconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you, DRC. Norway, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Norway takes note of the recommendation from the Permanent Forum to move away from the use of the term indigenous peoples and local communities on the grounds that indigenous peoples with special rights do not want to be equated with an as yet undefined category, local communities. The Norwegian position is that the commonly used indigenous peoples and local communities, as used in international context, does not imply a juxtaposition as far as rights are concerned, but is more to be understood as a compromise between those parties in international cooperation who recognize indigenous peoples and those who do not, at last not within their own borders. Norway, just to be clear, has long since recognized the existence of the Sami as an indigenous people and has ratified ILO Convention 169 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to this effect, and further established a Sami parliament and a special mechanism for Norwegian authorities to consult with the Sami parliament on all matters that may be of consequence to Sami identity, rights, and livelihoods. The consequences of moving away from the current use of indigenous peoples and local communities in international context, however, can be unclear, not least for the progress we have seen in the recognition of indigenous peoples' rights in recent years. So we, from the Norwegian side, propose to just take note of the proposal. And regarding Denmark's intervention on the BBNJ instrument, which my delegation was, of course, part of negotiating, it is right that it says in the preamble that you would recall the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But in the specific provisions in the BBNJ instrument, which is a very new instruments, it still has the indigenous peoples and local communities term. So in the operational paras, this pair is still used. Thank you.
Thank you, Norway. Côte d'Ivoire, the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. Côte d'Ivoire welcomes this proposal for the recommendation. We support fully the proposal that has been made by the DRC, and Côte d'Ivoire is also wondering what is the objective of the 21, 22, 23 of the targets of the global framework, targets 21 through 23. For us, we think it's the full participation of all of the entities listed therein to reach the objectives of the global framework. Why are we going after these, or why are we listing these different entities? We believe, for Côte d'Ivoire, it's about the role of the multi-sectoral value of these different entities that they have played and continue to play as part of the preservation of our natural resources. That is why, for Côte d'Ivoire, indigenous peoples and local communities are, it would seem, different entities, but the thing is that they have one single vision. If we look from the perspective of the convention, they have one single objective, one common objective, which is why, for us, we should not, at least at this stage, where they have walked hand in hand together for so long, when they've fought together for so long, why should we, at this stage, leave one side on the side of the road? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Côte d'Ivoire. Togo, here, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. As you saw, I think that since Montreal, we thought that we were more or less on the road to success, even though there are many years ahead of us in order to reach a level of implementation of the framework. Still, the draft decision that we have before us this morning creates a certain number of concerns and actually makes us raise a lot of questions, ask ourselves questions about this. Firstly, yes, we do welcome the work that's been done. Of course, it's not easy work. Let's recognize that. But we think that the draft decision, as presented, is very far from allowing us to actually make progress. Rather, it would create a number of difficulties in the implementation of the convention. Madam Chair, the issue that is before us is to understand what is the utility, what is the use of creating such a separation, a distinction. When these two entities working together, how would it help to reach the goals of indigenous peoples, and how would it somehow undermine their efforts because they've been trying to obtain rights? How would it help them obtain those rights or hurt them in obtaining those rights? Because what I believe is, be it a local community or an indigenous peoples, both need to take initiatives at a national level in order to be able to make sure that things are done to help each case. And in no way would it, we need to have it examined case by case. And if rights were to be given, for example, for a local community, it needs to be done. And if it were for an indigenous peoples, that also needs to be done. For the institutional framework, that is what should be reviewed. So what I would like to understand is that the subsidiary body, what does it think? Are we going to have two different subsidiary bodies, one for local communities and one for indigenous peoples? So those are the types of questions that we're asking ourselves, and which trouble us before this current situation. So that's why we still have a lot of debates ahead of us to understand the base of this division that has been proposed. I thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. And Togo also supports, of course, forgive me for coming back, but I have a little bit more time. So if I may, we of course support the statement that has been made by the DRC on behalf of the African group. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. South Africa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. We just raised a flag to support the statement made by the DRC, supported by Côte d'Ivoire and Togo. Thank you very much.
Thank you for keeping it short and sweet. The floor is still, unless there's no urgent, pressing needs. I understand it's a very complex topic, but I know the road is still very long for all of us involved. Can I give me a moment while I consult with the Secretariat? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So, well, I'm closing the floor. So after hearing your interventions, I feel that we have some consensus on a draft recommendation. With this in mind, I will prepare a conference room paper. We will definitely consult with the parties with the help of the Secretariat. And I would like to remind you to ensure that you have uploaded your written statements. And I would now like to give the floor to the Secretariat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just an announcement about the contact group on item 6. This afternoon at 3 p.m. Please be on time, as we have a lot of work to do, and it's going to be in room EF level 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I think we've been rewarded for an hour earlier for lunch. Thank you so much for your constructive discussion. And just to remind you as well, the contact group 1 on the new program of work will start promptly at 3 p.m. room EF on level 3. Additionally, please remember that on Tuesday, which is tomorrow, there will be no sessions of the working group that are scheduled as the ad hoc open-ended working group on benefit sharing for the use of digital sequence information and genetic resources will hold its plenary session. However, there is a possibility of a contact group on Tuesday evening. Confirmation of this will be provided during the evening session of the contact group. The meeting is adjourned, and I wish you a pleasant lunch.